I'd invite you to open your Bible to 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, and that'll be our first reading in just a second. As you turn there, let me just take a moment to say it is good to be here. It is good to look out and see a number who are visiting with us. We appreciate all of our visitors. I appreciate all of you who are members here that I fully expected to see this morning. It's good to have all of you, and I hope everyone will think along with me as we study both this morning and this evening a couple of lessons entitled Not Conformed to the World. And I want to begin by introducing an old saying. You've heard the saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. You know, there's a lot of truth to that. God called us to be a holy people, a people separated from the world, consecrated to Him. But when you do that, you're that nail that sticks up. And there's sometimes a tendency to get then hammered down. 1 Peter 4, verse 3, he's writing to some who made the choice to leave the world behind them. He said, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." Why were people speaking evil of them? Well, they were no longer sharing in these things they once had been a part of. And I will say to you, if you have had that kind of life in the past and you leave it, you'll be criticized, ridiculed. If you never participate in that lifestyle, which is what I would hope for all, you'll be ridiculed. One of the things that pushes us toward conformity is this persecution. And then there's a second thing. Conformity is just natural. Think about Romans 12 in verses 1 and 2. When he says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." I have sometimes used the illustration of our accent with which we speak. If you grow up in the South, you don't have to make a choice, a deliberate choice. I want to have a Southern accent. If you want something else, you'll have to really make a choice and fight against it, because it just comes natural. We just naturally become like that around us. If we want to be different, and He's calling us to be different. He's not saying we can't have a Southern accent, but He's saying you can't be like the world. That's going to take effort. So when we think about not being conformed to this world, it takes effort. There's got to be a willingness to suffer ridicule, persecution. In every generation, there are dangers to the Christian. And, you go through the New Testament, you look at things that are condemned. In some generations, those things are going to be more of an issue than others. A few weeks ago, I think it was the first Sunday of the month, I did a lesson talking in general about the dangers our world presents to us, and talking about the fact that in some ways each of us have our own little world. And if you didn't hear that lesson, I would really encourage you to go back and listen to it, because in it we dealt with some general principles about how I can be different from my world, the need to be different from my world. But today, I'm going to be talking about 5 dangers, specific dangers. And I'm not going to do all 5 this morning. I'm going to do 2 this morning and 3 this evening, Lord willing. They're not an exhaustive list, but I hope they'll be a good start for some things that we really need to be careful about. And the first one is sexual immorality. And somebody may be saying, well, that's always been a problem, and it has. You look at the first century as depicted in the New Testament. Read Romans 1 as he is showing why the world needed Christ. And that's really what Romans 1 and 2 and the first half of chapter 3 is about. Why does the world need Christ? Well, he said the Gentile world has moved away from God. They've moved into the unnatural sins of homosexuality and other things. You take a New Testament letter like 1 Corinthians, written to the church of God, which is at Corinth, those called to be saints. And in chapter 5, he said, you got to deal with this man who's taken his father's wife. In chapter 6, there is a lengthy warning against sexual immorality. Now keep in mind, he's not out here preaching in the marketplace. He's writing a letter that was to be read to the Christians at Corinth. And he has to make arguments to show them how wrong it is to be engaged in sexual immorality. In the book of 2 Corinthians, near the end of that book, and I don't think we study 2 Corinthians sometimes as often as we do 1 Corinthians, a lot of things had improved since that first letter. They'd gotten some things right. But look at him at the end of chapter 12. For I fear lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I wish, that I shall not be found by you such as you do not wish, lest there be contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbitings, whisperings, conceits, tumults, lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented of the uncleanness, fornication, and lewdness which they have practiced. He said, I'm afraid I'm going to arrive in Corinth, and there are going to be Christians among you who've never turned away from their sexual immorality, from all their lewdness. That's a strange thing to write to a church, it would seem. But that was kind of the cultural norm. And yet, as the gospel of Jesus Christ spread, and even when it wasn't even in its purest forms, the influence of Christ was felt. Many cultures moved away from this being the norm. And for a long time in the United States of America, sexual immorality was not really the norm. It existed. There's never been a time, from first century to now, that there has not been immorality. But you think about before I was born, and even when I was born, the first few years of my life, divorce was not easy to obtain unless you were in Nevada. They were known for, Las Vegas was known for that. But divorce was not nearly as common. Oh, there were people who engaged in sexual relationships outside of marriage, before marriage, but it was not the accepted norm. Homosexuality was certainly not accepted as the normal thing. But what's happened today? There's been a drastic change. Divorce is cheap, it's legal everywhere you go. It's accepted. A couple living together outside of marriage, most people don't think anything of that. They don't look upon that as a shameful thing to be hidden. And of course, homosexuality. It is normalized, it's glamorized, it's celebrated in so many ways. Now think about some things. The Bible's teaching on this subject. It's not hard to understand. I think we'd all recognize there are certain things in Scripture that are more challenging to understand than others. But when Jesus said, Matthew 19:6, what God's joined together, let not man separate. When he said in verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That's not that hard to understand. When he would say in Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Any thinking person understands what he's saying is the marriage bed is sanctified. Sexual relations outside of the marriage, they're wrong. In 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 10, he would say, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. And then he says, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites. And he goes on to name 5 more. But notice, 4 of these are sexual immorality. And sexual immorality was often associated with idolatry. He said, these don't inherit the kingdom of heaven. Let me ask you, is sexual immorality so rare among Christians? Is divorce so rare that it just shocks us when we hear about it? No. I'm not going to suggest it's the norm. I don't believe it is. But it's not like we're just, I just can't believe that happened. No. We've seen too much of it. It happens too often. Because Christians are impacted by culture. What happened to our culture? Why did something that was not so acceptable in our country, and we could say this about cultures around the world, why did it become accepted? There are a lot of root causes. I think Darwinian evolution is one of the things. As academics and elites began to buy into the idea that, we're nothing but animals, maybe advanced animals, but we're animals. Animals are not held to a standard of morality. Why should Christians? No. And advances in contraception and medical treatments of diseases, they took away some of the consequences of immorality. All of these things play into it. I want us to understand the errors of Darwinian evolution. We had a special series here a while back to understand that. We're not animals. And the consequences we ought to be worried about the most are not unwanted pregnancy and disease. We need to be thinking about eternal consequences. But what I really want to drive home to you this morning is how pervasive it's become in our culture and how we need to guard our minds against this. Our culture really has changed. Most of my lifetime, the music has promoted immorality. Although I can still remember the Beatles, one of their first big hits was I Want to Hold Your Hand. That's pretty tame compared to by the time I was in high school and Bob Seger singing about the night moves and, the immorality. But really by the late 60s and on up until today, so much of the popular music, and I don't care what genre you're talking about, country, pop, rock, rap, it doesn't matter. It promotes immorality as the norm. And TV, movies, books, they portray it as something normal. Sometimes we we'll watch a television show and we'll say, well, there's no profanity, no nudity in it. I would offer sometimes the less preachy, if that's a word, the less preachy a show is, sometimes the more dangerous it is. If someone comes on, let's say it's a news show, and they're arguing it's okay to sleep with someone before you're married, it's okay to practice homosexuality, well, your defenses are up. And you start immediately thinking of things. But they're just a little character in the show. It's just the normal. If we're not careful, what happens over time is we become desensitized to this. It's just normal for there to be, people divorcing. Oh, the fire went out. We just found we weren't that compatible anymore. We still are friends, but we go our separate ways. That's normal, right? That's what happens all the time on TV, in the movies. You watch a TV show about people looking to buy a house. Well, it's just normal that it's two men living together, right? I mean, there's nothing sensationalized about it. Or, this couple that, we're hoping to get married sometime in the next few years, but we want to go ahead and get our first house together. Those kind of things, if we're not careful, they wear down our defenses. They don't cause us to put up our defenses. And then you throw in the explosion of pornography in our generation. I want you to look at Matthew 15 with me. And I want to be honest with you. I'm not trying to say to you, okay, hearing one song on the radio, watching one movie that featured a gay character, watching one television show that had, one of the characters was a player. I'm not saying that's going to cause you to lose your morality. But look at Matthew 15. Jesus had been, questioned about the not washing of hands. And he said, that's not where defilement comes from. And he says, verse 18, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. What does Galatians 5 call immorality? A work of the flesh. But it's not strictly a biological impulse. We can control biological impulses. It comes out of the heart. You continually poison the mind, it's going to manifest itself. Back up a few chapters to chapter 12 of Matthew. Verse 33 says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or else make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For a tree is known by its fruit. Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A good man, out of the good treasure of his heart, brings forth good things. And an evil man, out of the evil treasure, brings forth evil things. My question this morning is, can we maintain good hearts if we continually put the bad things into our hearts? And our minds are continually just being bombarded by the normalization of that which God says will keep one from the kingdom of heaven. Let's be more careful, more selective in what we feed ourselves. We're often told about how to feed our bodies. What are we feeding our minds? That's important. In a related note, I want to talk about indecent clothing. And I want you to turn to 1 Timothy 2 with me. The only New Testament passage that specifically addresses proper clothing. And I want you to notice something about it. It doesn't talk about modesty as we often use the term today. It's in the context of the roles of men and women. And he says in verse 8, I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now, I read a little lengthier part than what we usually read when we're talking about modest apparel, but I want you to see, what's he talking about here? He's talking not about scantily attired women. He was talking about women whose clothing reflected the fact they didn't have the quiet place that he intended for them. The men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. The women, a second role. Now, in the Old Testament, Proverbs 7:10 talks about the attire of a harlot. Well, maybe that gets a little closer. Except, what was the attire of a harlot? Was it real scanty? Was it lewd? Or was it just some particular color, design that signified their profession? I don't know. Now, let me tell you, those points, I've made two valid points. And some people say, that's where we need to stop. Let's just move on then. Because the Bible really doesn't address specifically these things. In the words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. If you don't know Sports Center or Game Day, that's where that's from. But not so fast. Let's understand, some things can be wrong without being spelled out. Think about the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. Now, I've heard this misused many a time, but it needs to be used. He says the works of the flesh are manifest, which are. And he names them, then he gets to the end, he said, and the like. Now, when I say misused, some people say, well, where's such and such? It's the like. Well, I mean, I can't just assert that. But it is a fact. Paul said this is not the complete list. There are things that are wrong that I've not listed here. Look at Hebrews, the 5th chapter, in verses 12 through 14, and I think this one really enters into this discussion. Verse 12 says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age. That is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. The discernment of good and evil isn't always just reading down a list. There are some lists. You don't have to have your senses exercised through usage to know what the list in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10 means. But he says, sometimes you've got to apply some thought to this. And you've got to grow up in maturity a spiritual maturity that allows you to say, whoa, it may not be specified, but that's not something I ought to be doing. I've got 3 reasons that I think we need to be concerned about the indecent clothing of our culture. First of all, there is the fact that everything I do, including the way I dress, ought to be a part of letting my light shine. Matthew 5 and verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Don't lose your flavor. Then he says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. A part of my obligation every day in every way is to be a light for Christ. Look at the end of 1 Corinthians 10. A discussion had begun at the beginning of chapter 8 about an issue that we just don't face today. Meats offered to idols. I've never faced that. But there is a principle laid out at the very end of chapter 10 that I believe applicable in all times. Verse 31, therefore, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Now there's my first part. Then he says, give no offense, either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. Don't offend. Don't be a cause of stumbling to outsiders or to insiders. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many that they may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. Paul was concerned about his actions, that they not be a stumbling block to people. In 2 Corinthians 8, 20 and 21, when he's talking about the collection for the saints, and he's talking about each church had appointed messengers to travel with him, he said, providing things honorable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We need to be good influences. And going back to Matthew 5, I want to read you something that is a joke today. You have heard that it was said to those of old, verse 27, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It's a joke. I mean, as long as nothing happened, surely it doesn't really matter. Jesus said it matters. He said what's in your heart matters. And is there anybody who would seriously take the position that clothing or lack thereof can be a contributing factor to lust? I mean, I just don't see how we can deny that. Then, there's a third principle. Matthew 18, 6 and 7. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses. The margin says enticements to sin. Woe to the world, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. I understand we can't control the thinking of others. And we need to develop our own sense of self-control. I've said before, I will say again today, I'm not giving anybody an excuse, a free pass because, oh, well, they didn't dress properly, so therefore my mind was filled with evil thoughts. You need to be developing a control of the mind. But he's saying here, don't be a stumbling block. If clothing or lack thereof can be an enticement to sin, and I just don't see how anybody can deny that. And I shouldn't be a part of that. Culturally, it's kind of interesting what's happened in my lifetime. It's almost been like the cycle. In the 60s and the 70s, that's what people like to call my formative years, The mini skirts were the rage. The short shorts, they were the thing. Guys wore shorts that were shorter than a lot of men's underwear today. That was it. And I'll tell you, skimpy attire never went away, especially places like the beach or the pools. But in everyday life, we had a bit of a transition. Skirts got longer. They weren't wearing the mini skirt all the time. You didn't just stand out if you weren't. And guys' shorts, maybe it went back to the Fab Five of Michigan. I'm not sure if that's the ones that started it, but guys' shorts were suddenly longer, more decent. But look where we are now. We're cycling back around. We're coming back to the shorter shorts for the guys and the girls and the shorter skirts. Lower, tighter, more sheer. I've said before, I say again, I'm not here about the dress code. And I don't think I have to get into a biological, anatomical discussion of, what entices people. And I want you to ask yourself, is what I'm wearing too low? Am I revealing that which is enticing? Is it too short? Is it too tight? Maybe you're covering, but you're covering it with virtual paint. Is it just too sheer? I'll be frank with you. I'm not bothered as much by the fact that sometimes people draw the line in a place differently than where I would draw it, as I'm bothered by the fact that I don't think a lot of people are even drawing lines. That people aren't, somebody looks at these questions, and they come up with a little bit different answer than me. Okay. What I'm concerned is I don't think the questions are being asked. That by some, and I don't mean to indict everybody, and many of you do great. But when we live in a culture that it's all around us, and fashion is moving increasingly, it seems, in that direction, are we willing to ask ourselves the tough questions? Questions that may cause us to look different than those around us. Questions that may cause us to be that nail that sticks up and gets hammered down. Going back to what I said, it's only natural. It's easy to go into the store and find the immodest attire. And I'm using immodest now as it's so often used today. Indecent. It'll take more effort to find that which is decent and holy and not a stumbling block. But it's worth the effort. The line exists, folks. The line in which you become a stumbling block, in which you become an enticement to sin, it exists. Don't dare deny its existence. Go through these questions. And parents, help your children learn to ask the questions. Help them learn to discern good and evil. Hopefully, you train them to where they make the right decisions on their own in time. But you also, much like as you train them in eating, you want them one day to grow up and understand the importance of eating broccoli. Sometimes you just have to make them eat it. Sometimes with dress, their powers of discernment, despite your best efforts, won't be what they ought to be. And parental authority has to come into play. When I think about Israel of old, they so often became like the nations around them. And they suffered greatly for it. I hope we will do better. I want to close with Romans 12 again. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Let's not be conformed. Let's be transformed by the renewing of our mind. But you notice that at the very beginning? He said, I'm imploring you by the mercies of God. Romans 12 is not the first chapter in the book. He's taken them through the love of God as manifested in Jesus Christ at the cross. The resurrection of Jesus Christ and that hope that we have in Christ. He has revealed to them the great mercies of God. And he said, based upon those mercies, let's live for Christ. And I want to encourage you, let that control your thinking, your actions, and everything. And if those mercies of God have never brought you to Him, if you've never allowed the cross to just take hold of you and bring you to Jesus, I hope this will be the day that you say, I'm ready to turn from the world's way of sin. I'm ready to be a disciple of Jesus. Have my sins washed away in His blood. If we can help you, you come as we stand and sing together. Thank you for watching this video. We're glad that you have found our channel. And in fact, while you're here, we would encourage you to subscribe to the Jones Road Church of Christ channel. We have several videos already up, and we believe you'll find these to be true to God's Word, helpful to you in your journey toward God. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and let us know how we can help you.